We're going to jump into a conversation we've been at for several months now in Matthew's gospel. Matthew's one of Jesus' followers, and he wrote down quite a long letter describing some of his experiences with Jesus face to face when they were together for about 3.5 years during the end of Jesus' ministry. And throughout that, he presents this idea that we as followers of Jesus are entering into a kingdom, really. We're a part of a kingdom that kind of operates in this world. Like, yeah, you're citizens of whatever country you're citizens of physically in this world. But at the same time, as a follower of Jesus, you have a different citizenship. And it's in God's kingdom. And things operate a little differently in God's kingdom. Jesus' ways of living and operating in life are a little bit contrary to just about every human way of operating that you can possibly imagine. And so we want to bring that into our present reality. And we also look forward to this future hope that some of these songs sung about just moments ago, about the hope that God has out before us in the future. And the Bible has a lot to say about that as well. But we're jumping into this conversation, and just to kind of catch you up to speed if you're newer with us, Jesus' followers have asked him a couple of questions because he had this conversation. And again, these are just a couple days before his betrayal and arrest and crucifixion, as far as like chronologically in the story of Jesus' life, how that's going. And he was having this conversation, and he spoke of a future time, a time when the temple in Jerusalem would be ripped apart stone by stone. Some of these stones weigh tons. I mean, how is this going to become a reality? He also talked about a time when his own followers, Jesus' followers, would be harmed, some of them, killed some of them, or mistreated, or chased away from their towns. They wouldn't be accepted by their communities. And then he talked about a time when he was going to leave the temple area, but someday he would come back. And all this was kind of vague, and his disciples, his followers were asking him, like, what are you talking about? When are these things going to happen? And what's going to be a sign that these things are about to take place? Instead of Jesus giving them like a day, a month, and a year like we would expect today, or something very concrete, he said, well, the world's going to keep operating in a lot of the same ways that it has been. People are going to commit injustices. There's going to be wars. There's going to be natural disasters, and then someday I'm going to show up. And as far as the signs, there's going to be some armies that are attacking Jerusalem from time to time throughout history. And there's going to be some conflicts that result in casualties. And there's going to be some chaos happening in the ordered world around you. And then, someday I'm going to show up and catch you by surprise, catch you off guard. And so probably not the satisfying answers that Jesus' followers are hoping for as far as the when and where of all these things they've been asking about. But I mentioned at the end of our time last week, I think that's for a reason, because I think if we were so preoccupied, if we knew, the day and the time when some of these things that Jesus spoke of or promised would happen, we'd just get focused on those things and preoccupied with them. And we couldn't focus on the here and now. And I think that that's where Jesus leads our discussion from this point on. And he's going to tell some stories. How many of you like a good story? You like to read books, maybe fiction books, or if you have kids or grandkids, you pull out a kid's book, and read a story. And Jesus is a master of telling stories. And these stories called parables, they have a comparison point. Like he tells a story about a very real life thing going on in their culture, and then he makes a point, or at least causes them to think, what is the point that Jesus is driving at here? And so he's going to tell them a couple stories. And so we're going to talk about those stories this morning. We'll have some group discussion to get what your thoughts are about that. And this is what he says before he starts to tell these stories. This is kind of in conclusion. In response to those questions you've asked and the vague answers that I gave you, he says, therefore, as a result, since I've told you these things, stay awake. Some translations say be alert. But the idea of it is literally stay awake. He says, since you all don't know what day your Lord is coming, your master is coming. And the idea behind that word know, there's different words for know that the New Testament uses, and that idea is perceive. So he's kind of like saying, stay awake, because you really can't tell when your Lord's going to come back. You don't know. It's kind of a mystery. And so he's going to tell some short stories that help us know what to do in the here and now and how to process all that. And here's the story that Jesus tells first. So I'm going to read the story to you. It's up on the screen here on the next slide, so you can go ahead and advance that. So we're going to read through this, then we're going to talk about what in the world parables are and how to use that. We've talked about that in the past on Sunday mornings, so we're going to do a little exercise with this, try to come to some understanding of it, and then we'll move along into the next story that Jesus tells after that as well, to give us an idea of, what are we supposed to be up to until then, till these future things that Jesus' followers ask questions about. But this is the first story. He says, come to learn this. And so that's a process, right? How many of you knew everything you know now your entire life? right? I mean, we start off in the education system, it's called like preschool sometimes, or kindergarten, right? And we come through this lifelong learning process, and then through different events that happen and different sports that we try and different experiences we have and different illnesses that we face, God teaches us a whole lot of stuff about life one day at a time. It's a continual learning process. And so when Jesus tells these stories, what he's doing is he's inviting us as a community into a learning process. And so you might hear this story today and you pick up a couple things on it. And then you have a conversation about one of the stories Jesus tells over dinner with some friends. And you're like, you know what? I think I discovered a couple more things hidden in there. And then 20 years down the road, you're just, chewing on this parable as you come to read it or something, or you're reading back through some of the stories Jesus told and you think, oh, wow, I never saw that before. So it's a continual learning process. But here's this parable. He says, come to learn this. If the head of the household had perceived which watch or which time of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into or dug through or rummaged through or pillaged, right? So it seems like kind of an odd story. I mean, this is something we can relate to today. Hopefully, most of you haven't had your homes broken into, but some of you may have. Somebody comes in, they break into your car when you're away from it. They break into your home. I remember Christina and I were on our honeymoon, and the car next to us had the window shattered out of it. We're just at one of these viewpoints, looking out, and we pulled up to a car, and somebody had just knocked the window out with their elbow and stolen the purse or something off the front seat and then ran away. This is the world that we live in, right? People take things from other people sometimes. But Jesus said if the person that was overseeing the household, like the person who was in charge, they knew when the thief was coming, they would have stayed up. And they wouldn't let their home be broken into. And he's saying this to teach us something about, or at least to summarize his point to his students. You need to stay awake. And so when we look at parables, we wrestle with parables and try to figure them out. A couple things to keep in mind. One, they're comparison stories. And so the person who's the head of the house, who's supposed to stay awake, it's comparing to something in our experience. And the thief is something that we're supposed to compare to something in our experience. Also, normally the characters in the parables are really important, and they symbolize some characters that we're supposed to identify with in our lives, or at least in our reading of the Bible stories. And so we're supposed to ask ourselves, I wonder who that homeowner whose house got broken into, whose car got, broken into, I wonder who that's supposed to represent. And then that thief in the story, I wonder who that's supposed to represent. And then we're supposed to look at the context of what's going on around it. Okay, Jesus has just had this conversation. His followers have been asking, when are these things you predict are going to happen? When are you coming back? When are people going to stop suffering who are following you? When's all that going to come, to play out? And so somehow all that's jumbled up in the blender with this parable as well. So we're supposed to relate it to the things around us. And so I just want to get your thoughts on this. Again, this is new. I just threw this at you. But who are the main characters? Not who do they symbolize, but in this parable, who are the main people? We talked about this already. Who are they?
Jesus, sin, and ourselves.
Okay, you're getting deeper already. I'm just talking surface level. Who are the two characters, in the story? The thief is one, right? And the homeowner, the head of house, yeah. And in this culture, it's it's more than just the homeowner. It's the person that's the head of the family, the extended family that are living together. Many families at this point in time in history had slaves in the Roman Empire. And so any slaves in the household, it's the one person, usually the oldest male in the house at this point in history, who's in charge of it all, okay? The homeowner. That's one. The thief is the second one. So then you go to the next level. Who do the main characters represent? Who do you think? I mean, we haven't really taken time on this. You're just getting it at first glance. Who would you think? Who would you think that the homeowner symbolizes? Us? All right. Why do you think that? Why do you think that? I don't know. Because we're heads of houses. I don't know. Because the context, okay. Because maybe this is supposed to make a point to us as the listener, we're supposed to be the ones that are doing the action. It seems like the homeowner here is the one that's being challenged, right? To stay awake. And Jesus is trying to teach people something, and he's just told his followers to stay awake. So probably, maybe that's related to us, okay. Or his followers at the time, at least. What about the thief? Who do you think the thief is in the story?
Satan.
Okay, Satan, all right. Any other thoughts?
A guy who has a bad
Okay, a guy has a bad home life and needs things, maybe. Yeah. Anybody who opposes the norm. Okay. Parables are tricky. I want to show you the next statement here. You can go ahead and advance the slide. Here's what it says next. Jesus gives us a clue in who the characters are in the next phrase, and I think it's going to surprise you. He says, this is why you also are to be ready. Up, ding, 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 right? Okay, who's the person who's supposed to be ready? It's the homeowner, right? Who's that? Us, right? His followers then, and maybe we can apply that to us today. We have to be careful applying everything across the board and saying, well, that was his followers then, that's us. But in this situation, I think it is. It's pretty broad across the board. But then he says, because the Son of Man. Now, who's the Son of Man referring to? Yeah, Jesus. It's a phrase he uses. He talks about himself in the third person using this title, Son of Man, which has some different meanings throughout the Old Testament, but he applies it to himself, focuses on his humanity, focuses on his representation of like succeeding in ways that the first human, Adam, failed in. So there's different symbolism behind it. He's talking about himself. So because the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't expect. Who came at an hour someone didn't expect in the story? The thief. Who's the thief? Jesus. Whoa, that's kind of a shocker, huh? Because these parables, again, we have to be careful about, how we apply them. And he uses things in tricky ways, and he has twists sometimes. So he's saying, I'm like that thief. So be careful what you presume about me. And I think what's interesting about this introductory story is it doesn't necessarily clarify yet what staying awake means, but it tells us what staying awake doesn't mean. First of all, one of the first things he said in that statement, he talked about in the verse prior, he said, be alert, since you all don't perceive what day your master is coming. Okay? And so he says, just out the gate, very first, you don't really perceive what day your master's coming. And I think in that statement he's talking about, himself and his return in the context of everything we're dealing with. So he says you don't really perceive it. I think on the one hand, when we think about what are we supposed to do until then, in the here and now, sometimes a lot of people think, well, what I'm supposed to do is try to perceive when this is all going to happen. When is Jesus going to return? And so every morning it used to be I grab the newspaper from the front porch and read the headlines, and now I open my cell phone, my smartphone, and I get my news app, and I start scrolling through all the things that are happening in the world. You probably do it. I probably do it daily too. What's going to happen? And we try to perceive, is today the day? Is this the month? Is this the year? When are all these things coming down? And Jesus has told us ahead of time, you really can't totally perceive that. So should we get preoccupied with trying to guess? And then the next word he uses here in that last verse was presume, right? We make presumptions. Well, some of us, surely it's going to be this year, and so how does that affect what we do today? For some people, I was talking to somebody, I forget if it was somebody, I work a second job some days, and I think it was one of my coworkers there who was telling a story about some people who heard that there was an alien spaceship that was going to arrive on a certain day a few years ago. And so there was this large gathering of people, and they were out in the field for several days waiting for the day when the alien spaceship was going to arrive. And of course, the day came and went, and no alien spaceship arrived, right? But sometimes maybe we get the same idea, it's going to be soon, so I'm just going to sit there and wait and look up at the sky and hope it's today, Well, what are you doing? I don't know. I'm just looking up at the sky, but I'm not really accomplishing a lot. And then other people, it's we're using all our resources to try to prepare for something that we feel like is imminently coming, but then we don't have those resources available to help in other ways. And then for others, the presumption is the opposite end of the spectrum. This isn't ever going to happen in my lifetime. So really, who cares how I live, right? I'll live how I want, and I'll let people in generations down the line, if this ever happens anyway, I'll let them deal with it. And people are already having conversations by the end of the time of the New Testament about that. Well, it's been several decades now, and everything's going on just like it did every day previously. So is Jesus really going to ever return? And those same conversations carry on. So we can extrapolate that out and say, well, this is never going to apply to me, so who cares how I live now? And Jesus is saying, be careful about making those presumptions, I think. Instead, stay awake. Be ready. So what is it? We know what it means to not, what it doesn't mean. It's not about making presumptions or assumptions or all these things. So what does it really mean? What does Jesus want us to focus on? Again, in the here and now. What does staying awake mean? And to answer that question, Jesus is going to tell us 3 more stories, right? So this is like story hour. And we're only going to focus on one of them in our remaining time this morning, and then we'll talk about the next 2 next week. But he's telling another story. It's another parable, and so we've got the same kinds of questions to ask. What's the context around this? Who are the characters? What do they represent? It's going to tell us a couple of things. And here's the first half of the next story Jesus tells. He says, who then is a faithful and wise slave? So again, slavery is rampant throughout the Roman Empire. People guessed that 1 in every 3 people in the city of Rome, which was, several 100,000, maybe to 1.5 million people, 3 million people at this point in time in history, 1 out of every 3 was a slave. Slavery is very common in the Roman Empire. So Jesus is telling parables, and they involve characters who are, common characters you would encounter in everyday life in the first century. So who then is a faithful and wise slave? And you might be able to also translate faithful and wise as reliable and reasonable. That's how I'm going to use it here. Faithful, reliable, wise. It has to do with you being reasonable with your decision making, and we'll talk about more examples of that as Jesus goes on. So who is that reliable and reasonable slave? Whom his master has put in charge of his household to give the household food at the proper time. So we're thinking about this person who, it's a slave in a household, but it's like the manager slave who is in charge of making sure everybody in the entire household is slave-free, family, extended family, everybody gets fed. So it's like a Joseph character in Egypt in the Old Testament, if you want something to compare it to. They've got a lot of responsibility that's been put on him, but reliability is super important, because if you're not reliable, people don't eat, right? He says, blessed is that slave whom the master finds doing so when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. And that's the first half of the story. You're like, I wonder what that story means. So we have to sit down and we have to have conversations. We can have a short one now, and then maybe, 6 months from now, you can kick this story around the living room or around the dinner table with some believing friends and say, what do you think about this? Did we not pick up on certain aspects of the story? And so who do you think the main characters are? Not the symbolism, not the next level, but who are the main characters in that short little story Jesus tells? The slave, particularly the slave that's been put in charge of all the food, right? The one who's feeding everybody. And who's the other one? The master. Yeah, and this is very common. There's a lot of parables Jesus tells that have figures like this. So those are the 2 main characters. He tells a parable about the head of the household and about the slave, and also about the master of the household. Who do you think they represent? Who do you think the slave represents? Maybe us, me. That's pretty, I've heard several people say that. Why do you think the slave represents us? I'm hearing murmurs, but I can hear pretty well in here, but I can't hear specifics. Why do you think the slave is us, or Jesus' followers at the time?
We're the ones who serve a master.
Okay, we're the ones who serve a master, okay? So Jesus seems to be giving, again, pointers of how to live until then, right? So makes sense. What about the master? Who do you think the master is? The Lord, Jesus, God, those kinds of answers. I think that's probably all in the right realm of the way that we should perceive this. Yeah. What do you think the point is?
Be ready to go at any time, because I can come back at any time.
Okay, let's think about that for a second. Be ready to go at any time. We have to be careful, because if we push too hard on that, then it takes us back to the previous one of we're just going to be like sitting out watching the sky, right? So I would say yes, in a sense. It is being ready, but it's not being ready in the just watching and waiting sense. It's being ready in a different sense. It's directing us towards some actions. So what do you think? What is another aspect of the point of this? Because it is stay awake, but it's what? Okay, to be reliable, reasonable, and wise. So that's probably giving us a clue, right? The first couple of things. How are we going to be reliable?
Take care of our fellow people in service.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very practical thing. Take care, she says, of our fellow people in service, right? People's pretty broad. What did somebody say over here?
Do your job. Do what you're supposed to be doing.
Okay, do your job, do what you're supposed to be doing. And then this sets out a conversation of what is our job and what are we supposed to be doing, right? And that, running around with our heads cut off, yeah. Some days we feel like it, right? But it's a conversation of what is this life? What is the life of a Jesus follower really supposed to be about? And that, what?
Teaching of Jesus.
It's the teaching of Jesus, but living it, right? Letting it, like kind of what June said again, taking care of the needs of people around us. And it pushes us back into chapters 5 and 6 of Matthew, where Jesus said, if you want to walk my walk and live my way of life, here's how you live among people. And a lot of these practical things. And so, on one sense, it's the reminder that each of us has been charged with caring for some kind of consistent need, right? And you could say in our church, but I think based on the way that Jesus operates and teaches, you could broaden it and say, in our community as well. Because it's not just about focusing inward, it's about focusing outward. And so maybe one way to apply this and one way of being reliable, it's to and again, it's very similar to what June was saying, but it's thinking, if I'm in the position of being this servant who's in charge of something in my master's household, what is that thing that God has me over? And from this story, it makes us think, well, it's probably some key need, but there's so many needs. It's like there's a need that fits you. There's something that you can fulfill. And I think about how this church community has operated, more recently. Some of you are on this prayer team because there's a need. People have needs, and they need those needs prayed for. And you have a heart for that, and God actually works and does things as a result of prayer. And so that's some of your way of meeting needs. Others of you run recovery ministries because there are people in our community that are just being chained by different types of substances maybe that have invaded their life. They have a physical or a chemical addiction or a mental addiction or emotional addiction. There's things that are chaining people. And so you're helping to give people hope and some practical steps to take. And others of you are involved in caring for kids. Right now even, people are caring for kids so that maybe mom or dad can have a short break and sit and listen and focus, and the kids can have stuff that's appropriate for them, whether it's play or whether it's, conversation and discussion and teaching on their level. Some of you are really involved with maybe a specific community project. Maybe your thing is food. And so you use your culinary skills to provide meals for people, or you use your resources to, provide resources, or you volunteer at things like food banks to try to get food into people's hands. But the idea is there's some specific need that you can plug into, and each of us has that charge, that challenge, I guess is a better word in our culture, to find some need that we can meet. Just like this servant has a very important need, and he has to be reliable because that's an essential need. If we're reliable, those needs get met. Additionally, it seems like there's some bonus to being consistent in that. This is an interesting thing because I've worked a second job for the last probably 6 months, 7 months, something like that. And one thing that I see through that is that it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be incredibly talented and amazing at what you're doing. Really, the biggest thing is just being consistent and being reliable. And I've seen that rewarded from different people. Like the people who make Employee of the Month are not these people that are doing these earth-shattering things that alter the trajectory of this hotel that I work at. They're just the people that are doing their job consistently. They're showing up to work on time, and they're putting in, a good effort. They're taking what they've been entrusted with and being consistent with that. Those are the people that get the extra little rewards, like free items at our marketplace that we have there. I mean, that's what's valued. When there are promotions or when there are people who are being considered for having hours cut, it's the people that are performing that are consistent, right? That the bosses, the managers appreciate. It's just that consistency. And I think it's kind of similar in this parable. It's the idea that blessed is that slave whom the master finds doing this when he comes back. I mean, the master, the manager, the boss, maybe Jesus or God in this parable. If you're just consistently serving these people and meeting these needs, that's a great way to stay awake and to be engaged until that time. Instead of standing out in the field, looking for the UFO to touch down or waiting for Jesus to appear in the clouds, we are focused on some physical, tangible, important need. And each of us has a different bent. And so your need that you're focused on caring for is going to be different than the ones that I'm focused on caring for. But I think that maybe is a part of this parable. Also, the last statement's exciting too. It says, truly I tell you, he, this master, will put him, the servant that's reliable, in charge of all of his possessions. And it really is the term that means possessions in the New Testament, but the way that they define it in the Greek language is really interesting. It's, if you were to do it literally, it would be the things that you cause to exist. So this view of your possessions is stuff that you bring into existence. So like think of stuff, if you're an artist or if you like woodworking or something, your possessions might be your own creations. I know some of you maybe have made furniture for your homes or things like that. You've made, something for your shop. You've created or you've cooked a wonderful meal for your table. That's your possession because you've caused it to come into existence. Others of you work really, really hard and you earn money and you buy something, and that's your possession. Maybe you have a home or you have a boat or you have a car and you worked hard for that and you caused it to come into your world of reality, right? Through your hard work. And the idea of this, it says again, he, that master, will put him, that servant who's just being reliable, in charge of all of his possessions, everything he's causing to exist. But when you think of causing things to exist in the realm of God, it gets a little bit broader, right? Because think about things that God is capable of causing to exist. And so one thing that I took away, and again, this is the beauty of parables, because we'll talk this thing over and you could, talk it to death and you'd still come up with something new that I haven't seen or that you haven't seen. But basically, we don't have any idea of what Jesus, of what the Lord, of what God is capable of causing to exist. Like his possessions, the things that he can make or cause to come into being, we have no idea what he's capable of. But this verse says that he's going to put us in charge of that. And that gives the idea of, like, God is causing these things to exist through us. Like, you don't know if you're just reliable what kinds of opportunities God will bring along and what kinds of things God will bring about through you ultimately. I mean, you hear stories about people who accomplish great things or things that for the Lord. You're like, how did this happen? A lot of it happened because they were just being consistent with caring for needs, and God brought along opportunity, and then God did something through them that they never thought was even possible. And it was all because somebody was just being reliable and consistent, and God was working through them. And so that's a part of the answer of what it means to stay awake. Just be consistent and let God provide further opportunities and further inspiration, and you never know what he's going to create through you next that's going to care for people and meet the needs of people until then, until these things he spoke about happen. And then we're going to finish by talking about the second half of the story for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll wrap up. There were two words. One was reliable, and the other one was reasonable. So the second half of this story takes us into the realm, I think, of reasonable and unreasonable uses of the time until then. What it means to fall asleep or get drowsy, not to stay awake. So we're going to see the flip side of the coin. This is what Jesus says next. He says, but if that harmful slave says in his heart. So now we got a third character in the parable. It's not the one who's being reliable. It's a slave that has a bent toward causing harm to people. But if that harmful slave says in his heart, my master's delayed, who knows when he's coming back, right? This is the far opposite end of the spectrum of presuming, None of this is ever going to happen in my lifetime. I don't even need to be concerned. I can live however I want. And starts to beat his fellow servants. The word servants is always slaves here in the New Testament, so I just forgot to put it in brackets then. But starts to beat his fellow slaves and eats and drinks with intoxicated ones. That servant's master will come on a day he doesn't expect him and at an hour he doesn't know. Master is still going to show up by surprise. And then verse 51 we have to be really careful with. We're going to talk about that in a second. He will cut him to pieces. I mean, really? Let's talk about that. Well, we have to talk about that. It's a cultural thing. He'll cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, with the pretenders, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We've got to talk about gnashing of teeth too, because it's a cultural thing. So we'll focus on 51 in a second, but let's focus on 48, 49, 50 for a moment here. My master's delayed. It's not important. I don't need to stay awake. I can live like I want. I don't need to be concerned with the needs of other people. This is the contrast. Instead of contributing, this slave actually ends up causing harm, okay? And as a result, starts to beat his fellow slaves and eats and drinks with intoxicated ones. So he's not concerned with contributing and helping and meeting the needs of people. Instead, he becomes kind of harmful. And it's really easy to get judgmental here because there are certain things that are obviously harmful and abusive, and then there are other really quiet and deceptive ways of causing harm. And sometimes we can be causing harm and not even be aware of it. More in the realm of like relationships or the words that we use or the perspectives that we have, and we cannot even know it. And so we have to be careful because this could be us even though we think this would never be us here. So we have to be honest and humble enough when we approach that to say, is it possible that instead of caring for people's needs that I might actually be causing harm to people in my church and my community? Maybe it is. Maybe I've got some areas to reflect on, some areas to improve on. And then not only that, it talks about eating and drinking with intoxicated ones. And again, this is a parable. And so maybe there's some broader ways to understand this. We don't have a time to fully flesh that out this morning. But when I think about intoxication, I think there's a lot of different forms of it. Obviously, you can, drink too much alcohol and become physically intoxicated. But this is a picture of how I think intoxicated people act. Think about someone who's intoxicated. What are some traits of someone? How does someone act who is intoxicated? Or how might someone act? Because it's not across the board. If you've ever been intoxicated or known someone who's intoxicated, you have personal experience. But what is the mark of an intoxicated person? How can you tell? Okay, maybe slurred speech. All right, that's a sign of it. How else? How can you tell someone's intoxicated? Poor judgment, okay? And I think things like that are going to be maybe important principles for us to grab onto here. What else? Okay, she said, now, all right, June's going to be straight up front with you. She said they do stupid things with stupid people at the wrong place. So I'm going to say they have some indiscretion, right? They don't really realize, like, their inhibitions have gone aside, right? They don't really realize what reality is and how they're acting at the moment, right? Their control is loosened. Or you can just be straightforward. But anything else?
The smell.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it can be. And I mean, like, the reality is if you drink too much and you go toward alcohol poisoning, like, you're going to throw up as well, and that's going to add to that. It's not a pretty thing, but there are things that aren't pretty about intoxication. That's reality, sure. Anything else? Yes? Clumsy and uncoordinated, yeah. And I think, again, these are like the physical things we observe, but we can kind of make application to like, well, how would this play out in life as well? Different ways of intoxication, like a physical or an emotional or, a mental or a spiritual intoxication. What would that look like? What kind of damage would it cause? It'd probably cause the same kind of damage that, substance intoxication would cause. It's probably going to destroy relationships or at least severely affect them. It's probably going to rearrange your priorities. It's probably, like Dave said, going to affect your judgment in different ways, right? It's probably, in some ways, maybe it'll cause you to become angry or actually perpetuate injustice, right? When that wouldn't be your normal personality. But you've had too much, you're intoxicated, and now you just get mad, right? Maybe that's some people's reaction to alcohol or other substances. And that's some people's spiritual reaction, So I think this is a broader thing than that. And so, like, ultimately, instead of being this reliable servant, our sense of reason, our judgment, the way we respond, the way we deal with relationships, the way we rearrange priorities, it all goes downhill there, right? And then the master comes back, and we're caught off guard, and we say, well, I was living in such an unreasonable way. I wasn't thinking any of this through. Then it talks about in the story of how the master reacts to that. And there's a couple Hebrew idioms that are in this verse. And so, again, if we think about it in reality, is a master really going to do these things literally, cut a slave into pieces? Maybe verbally. That's a good thought. I hadn't thought on those, that plain, but maybe that's another thing we get from the parable. Physically, probably not normally, even in the Roman Empire. I mean, severe penalties would be death, but would they go to this extreme? Probably not. But that's a phrase that's used throughout the Old Testament. It has different implications, and we can't get into all of it this morning. But one of the interesting places where that phrase is used, it's used in Isaiah 51. And what's interesting about that context is the same phrase is like, wake yourself, stay awake, wake up, pay attention, that Jesus has been using over and over again in this passage in Matthew. They show up in Isaiah 51 as well in the context. So I think there might be some attachment, some correlation to that. This is what Isaiah 51, some verses from that chapter say. Pay attention to me, my people, and listen to me, my nation. For instruction will come from me, and my justice for a light to the nations. So he's saying you're supposed to be an instrument of my justice to the nations. We'll talk about justice perhaps around the Advent season this year because it's a whole lot more than what we would import into it. But a lot of it is our social responsibility in the way that we treat other people, or the way that we mistreat people would be injustice. So he's saying, pay attention, Israel, because you are treating people with injustice. And maybe those things apply to this story that Jesus is telling as well. He says, wake up, wake up. But he's talking first to the arm of the Lord, God's strength. He says, Lord, clothe yourself with strength. Wake up as in the days of the past and generations long ago. Wasn't it you who hacked Rahab to pieces, who pierced the sea monster? Like what? When did God defeat a sea monster? Again, this is like poetic. He says, wasn't it you who dried up the sea and the waters of the great deep, who made the seabed into a road for the redeemed to pass over? When did God dry up the sea and let his people pass over? The Red Sea, Egypt, Moses, right? Those stories. And so Isaiah is using imagery, and he's saying, when you brought Israel out of unjust treatment in Egypt, they were enslaved there. It was like you slayed the sea monster when you defeated Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. You hacked that sea monster to pieces. And so cutting something into pieces is when God confronts injustice, right? And so that's the imagery here. And then he tells Israel, wake up, wake yourself up, because you're committing injustice. And you know what God does to the injustice, to the sea monster, right? He confronts it. And so maybe that's what Jesus is talking about here. If instead of caring for people and meeting needs, we're just causing harm and perpetuating injustices toward people, maybe even with our attitudes that we have, God's going to come confront that someday. He says he'll assign him a place with the hypocrites, with the people who are pretenders. And I think Jesus is referring to the religious pretenders he's been having conversations with all throughout Matthew's book. Pharisees, Sadducees, other religious groups, Herodians, people who are pretending to be religious, but their hearts are really far from God, and their hearts are bent and their actions are bent toward all this injustice, right? So, and then gnashing of teeth, it describes an animal. How many of you have seen like a dog that's really ferocious and it like snarls and it shows its teeth like this kind of thing, right? That's what gnashing teeth is, and it's got imagery that's tied back to lions and ferocious dogs and animals in the Bible. And it's this idea of hatred and anger, right? The future of somebody like that, it's only hatred and anger and rage and sorrow and being with other people who are pretending. So being cut into pieces and gnashing of teeth are idioms, Hebrew idioms, that describe injustices and the hatred of people that think they're religious but really aren't. So Jesus is saying, be careful that you don't fall into that category. Because on the one hand, you might be caring for people and using your time here and now to meet very practical needs in your church and your community. And on the other hand, you might think you're incredibly religious, but you might actually be causing harm, and you might actually be filled with anger and hatred. So assess yourself and figure out who you are. And that's part of staying awake. It's being reliable and it's being reasonable. And it's a couple other things too, but we'll get to that next week.